Jim Brock another hand. What do you think? How about that? It's really always a delight to have Jim with us here. All right, we are rolling.
Good morning. Hello, everybody. My name is Daniel. I've been a member here for a couple of years, and I'm really pleased to be able to host this sermon talk back. I guess I got to do it earlier in the summer, and really am excited to hear us talk a little bit about Galatians, which, in my sense, seems to be maybe one of the most radical texts in the Bible. Yeah. And I appreciate your kind of reclaiming some of Paul. I know I've always both struggled with Paul and the things that are difficult about Paul, and also some of the just really rich, powerful words that he has. So I'm eager for us to have this conversation today. Okay, so here's a great tough question to get started with. Why is there a mention of these list of things? I'm assuming this means the difficult things.
Works of the flesh.
Works of the flesh in Galatians 19 through 21, in the light of freedom and love.
Great question. That's a fantastic question. I think we need to see that list, which always turns us liberals in a particular way, where we're like, I feel like this sounds like a kind of a controlling list. To look at that through the lens of community, and to see freedom, even as a concept in Paul, through the lens of community is critical, because Paul is writing to churches. He's talking about freedom in the context of community. He would have had no concept of individualism, because the Greek and Jewish mind simply did not have that concept that we have today as Americans. So he would always be talking about freedom in the context of community, and the things that he lists as works of the flesh would have been things that he imagined would be tearing down of community, things that had the potential, at least, maybe not always, but had the potential to hurt people, to hurt relationships, and to tear at the fabric of our trust in one another and our ability to work together for a common goal. So we have to see those lists not as a personal attack, and not as a, if you ever, commit any one of these in one time, you're not going to heaven kind of thing, which is sometimes the way I've had it preached, in churches that I grew up in. But really more see it as these are the kinds of things in community that have the potential to really break down our relationships with each other and make it very challenging to be in community together. And I think we have to see the whole concept of freedom, as well as these works of the flesh, as Paul describes them, as in the context of that. I think he also probably, and this goes to other pieces of my sermon, he probably has Romans in mind here when he's talking about works of the flesh. He's probably imagining Galatians taking on, accommodating to things that were pretty typical in Rome, a sort of attitude, a way of being, and he's also contrasting lawlessness with lawfulness, and really kind of dealing with the Galatians' history of being considered barbarians, and now calling them into this community together in the way of following Jesus. But I think we have to see it in the lens of community.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful way of framing it, in terms of it's not so much like sins of identity or things about you that are wrong, as much as how we act in a way that harms other people. And I think that's a helpful frame cause so much, I think, particularly in kind of traditional evangelicalism, is about if you are or do this thing that's sinful, and you need to ask forgiveness from God, as opposed to if you do this thing to hurt your neighbor or your community. And sort of to phrase those lists, the works of the flesh, as things that are harmful to other people, particularly within the community. Right,
and read through the lens of Southern American culture, what we end up having, if we think about it in terms of individual sinful behaviors or sinful identities, what we really do is protect we try to protect the things that were cultural values and that would have never been shared by first century people. So, for instance, there was this great piece in The Atlantic this week. It was a video piece featuring David Brooks about how the nuclear family was a mistake. It's like a long video about how the nuclear family was a mistake. Well, when I was growing up, everybody preached the Bible as if the nuclear family was the thing, the only thing that mattered, and all sin was determined in context to the family. So sexual morality would have been about a particular vision of the family and what vision of the family we needed to protect. So all sins were seen as in light of the family. So sexual immorality would have been about some kind of vision of adultery or homosexuality or even things like abortion, because all of it was to preserve this vision of the nuclear family that Paul did not share. And even early Americans did not share, living with 13 people in a household and grandparents and uncles and aunts and sisters and cousins and children all the way up through, that vision of like 2 parents and 2 children. That's not what Paul had in mind when he wrote these letters. And so when we look at the household codes that way, or we look at all of Paul's teachings about sin with a vision of the preservation of the nuclear family in mind, we completely misunderstand what he's trying to talk about.
Okay. Here's another good one, another challenging one. Okay, and it also comes with it says, your sermons always stir and challenge me. So prefaced with that. Can you speak to how those of us who consider ourselves progressive can tend to see MAGA world, or those who are complicit by their vote, corporate America, as the barbarians to demonize?
Ooh, yes. That was an interesting list, too, right? MAGA and corporate America in there as demons.
I can throw in a few more if you'd like.
I think saying there are no barbarians can be a real challenge after January 6th. I mean, that vision of barbarism is hard to turn away from when you look at Paul. I think the point is really the goal here is not to hold people accountable. I mean, we need to hold people accountable for their behavior, and I think that's true of both individuals who, storm a Capitol, or corporations who don't pay fair taxes or exploit their workers and don't pay fair wages. We're coming up on Labor Day, we should keep that in mind. But I also think when you start to demean someone, you begin a process that in some ways not only harms them, but takes you down a road also of dehumanization. Because as we dehumanize others, we dehumanize ourselves. And we also, in the process of dehumanizing people by calling them all barbarians, or somebody I heard recently said maggots instead of MAGA, and I remember folks doing this to Donald Trump, and these caricatures of him that were really humiliating. And I think I can understand the tendency to want to do that when a person is hurting and harming those you love in your community, in your world. And I think that is true of what the Trump administration did. And we could talk about immigrants, we could talk about many different groups of people. And if you have care and love for them, I can understand that. But when you start to dehumanize him, you begin this scapegoating process that actually doesn't take full account of the situation, right? We did not get Trump because of Trump. We got Trump because he's a reflection of who we are as a country, right? That's what we need to understand. And by caricaturing him, we sometimes make it harder to deal with the people that we caricature as if they're a joke or a clown. I think a lot of the we thought he was a clown mess is how liberals missed the boat in what they were up against. They thought he was a joke. In our arrogance, we thought, no, he could never get elected. I was guilty of that. He's just a clown. This will never happen. And what happened? Right? So we have to be careful not to go down the road of dehumanizing those that we see as our enemies or those that we see hurting others, because if we start, taking them down that road, then we begin to not see them clearly for who they are, or begin to really truly hold them accountable, I think. That was a mistake of the left.
And I think, too, for me, the challenge that I have, first of all, because, practicing what we preach and all that, but, dehumanizing another person lets ourselves off the hook, right, in terms of our own, not just complicity. As you speak to, I've wrestled with that, too, in terms of, how am I complicit in the politics in America that I don't agree with? But also just my capacity to do the things that I'm criticizing.
Yes.
Which is part of why I like this question in terms of how can we be careful to not, if we paint somebody else as less than human and ourselves as human, it creates this kind of good versus evil dichotomy where, like, I would never do that because I'm a human and this other is not. And in fact, like, that's the struggle, is that humans are doing these things.
Right.
And that includes us.
Yeah. The line between good and evil runs through every human being. And we have a very hard time imagining that we're capable of the same kinds of evil that other people are capable of. And so we can get very proud and almost self-righteous about it. And that is the process that leads to dehumanization. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot of great history in your sermon today.
Thank you.
I found myself sort of feeling like, oh man, it's like I'm back in seminary, but engaged. But
engaged, I like that.
More engaged.
Like that
more
caveat.
Engaged. Yes. So here's another good kind of translate history to today. What can America today learn from the fall of Rome? And also with that, how shall the church respond as modern day empires decline and fall?
That is, first of all, the second part of that question is amazing. The first part of that question is also really hard to answer, but I think one of the things we learn, well, there's a new Game of Thrones out. Let me just start there. Okay, there's a new Game of Thrones out, and it starts with this amazing discussion of the fact that they have 10 dragons, and they're a huge military, and they know that the only way for the empire to defeat itself, the only enemy they truly have is themselves. And they can only be destroyed from the inside. And so it begins with palace intrigue about who the next heir to the kingdom will be. And there's all kinds of discussion about who that will be. And that's how the new Game of Thrones, the House of Dragons thing begins. When I was watching that, I thought, that's what happened to Rome. May that also be what happens to America. There was no enemy that could defeat Rome. Rome had conquered most of the known world. Its army was larger than everybody. It was not just larger, but it was better trained. The 10th Legion, which was not a huge force, but a force you could just go read about, was so effective. They used it to quell every possible revolution in Judea and all around Jerusalem. It was the 10th Legion that came in and took down the Zealots. It was the 10th Legion that they sent everywhere there was an insurrection, and the 10th Legion was always victorious, every single time. There was nobody who was ever going to come and get them. You know, even the barbarians that I talked about today got them and then lost, and then got assumed into the Roman Empire. So by the time of the Gallic Wars, Julius Caesar is able to take up all the territory. So now the empire reaches all the way to the British Isles. They were never going to be taken out from outside. But internal political strife, internal politics is what eventually took Rome down. And all the stuff about Julius Caesar and then who was going to follow Caesar, and you could just see the decline happening from the inside, Now, there are a lot of people that want to paint that as the turning away from a republican form of democratic rule to imperial rule is the pathway to that. I don't know if you can argue that or not. And there's many books on this. Gibbon, somebody mentioned others, Edward Gibbon, who talked about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. You can go read volumes on why it happened. I think America is in the same place as the House of Dragons and also Rome. America is not going to get defeated by an external enemy. We're not going to win a lot of wars externally either, because I think warfare has changed, but we're not going to get defeated by an external enemy. We have the largest defense budget in the world. All other countries in the world combined don't spend as much as we do on defense. So we are not going to be defeated easily. If somebody strikes us, we will obliterate them, and that'll be it. That will be the end. If Russia uses a nuclear weapon, there will be no Russia the day after. Like literally, there will be no Russia on the planet the day after. I mean, we have more weapons than anybody, and we don't mind using them. We're the only people who've ever used nuclear weapons on a human population in history. I mean, we got the weapons. No one's coming at us from the outside. I mean, they might, bomb New York or here or there, like we had with the terrorist attacks, but we're not getting defeated in a military conflict. What will take America down from the inside is fascism, right? That's what's going to take us down from the inside. What will take America down from the inside is this just absolute anarchy created by economic disparity of the highest magnitude. You know, I think it was interesting this week, and I don't want to get too deep into this whole thing about student loans yet, because I'm going to preach about that later. But I looked at it and I thought, okay, he did one thing that will keep people from coming into the streets. Thank God, because it's bad. I mean, we're insulated from it. I'm insulated from it as a person in the middle class and have a home, and I don't have to worry about housing, and I'm not worried about where my next meal is coming from. But it is devastatingly difficult right now out there. We put an article in the newsletter this week that's coming out about our Sunshine Fund, which is almost empty, because we have been giving money away to people in despairing situations all year long. Folks in outreach know this. Mia could tell you about all the phone calls she gets every other day of somebody in another housing situation. And these are not people who have been housing insecure before or who don't have jobs. These are people who have jobs, they have families, they've always had jobs, right? And they can't afford their apartment rent, they can't afford their house. So how long does that go before people finally have had enough? I mean, what will it take? It's in some ways it's surprising that there's not people out in the streets now, but that you could explain that in a whole lot of ways. But I mean, the disparity is greater than it ever has been in American history. And, you know, the student loan relief that was provided this past week is great and fantastic and revolutionary, but it isn't going to change everybody's life, and it's not going to increase wages, and it's not going to change the housing crisis in America. So there's a lot more that has to be done. I worry that how far do you get between the poor and the rich? How far can that gap get before it's unsustainable? Think about what happened with the French Revolution. You know, Marie Antoinette is sitting up in the palace eating cake, and people are starving and have no bread on the streets, right? That's the mythology we have in our mind. She didn't really say that, but that's the mythology we have in our mind, right? Extreme aristocratic wealth, extreme poverty, and eventually the poor are going to go into the streets and do something about it. I mean, so I don't know how long it can go. We can keep going on the path that we're on. And I don't know what will happen first. I mean, that's the thing. I think America come down from the out. I mean, I think it'll be from the inside. Now, what can the church do? Oh, boy. Well, I think we have to start by reading what the church did as empires fell in previous history. The church has seen many empires come and go. The church watched the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. In fact, the church got blamed for it. I don't know if you know that. The church was blamed for the fall of the Roman Empire, and that's what Nero used as reason to put Christians in the Colosseum and have them attacked by wild beasts, because they blamed the Christian religion for the fall. I mean, cynically, you could argue that it was Christianity that may have led to the fall of America, but not a good Christianity, a bad version of Christianity that has gotten us to the place that we're in now. I'm not saying you should throw them to the lions, though. Let's be very clear. I think Christians have lived through the rise and fall of Rome, the rise and fall of Britain, the rise and fall of Germany, the rise and fall now of America. And we've learned from the past of what it means to live in faithfulness, I think, in those moments. I think we see Bonhoeffer. Everybody always brings up Bonhoeffer as an example of what it looks like to live, faithfully in the midst of the fall. The early Christian martyrs are an example, here but no further. This is my line. People who've said this is what it means to be Christian in this particular moment in history. We need to look back at those folks who turned against the tide of the culture as it was going in a nasty direction and said, we're going to create a community of love and peace and joy in the midst of this downfall. While the whole world is falling around us, we can still love each other in the midst of that. And I think that's kind of the call.
Okay, so here's another, so shifting away from sort of history and the immediate. Why does Paul, I think this is a good question, why does Paul bring up a duality of flesh and spirit, which kind of breaks up a sense of unity of both of these in Christ?
That's a tough question because Paul's dealing with a lot of dualities in this text, and he's trying to move beyond the dualities. As you can see, there is no longer Jew nor Greek, slave nor female, male nor female, slave nor free. So he's trying to get us beyond the duality into community and relationships of equality, and which is why he was so radical and considered so radical at the time. This text, Galatians 3:28, that I mentioned, also the one in Colossians, is often, almost always, proof text by liberal Christians for this is what church community is supposed to be. And I think Paul really believed that, and I think in the time frame, Paul would have been considered extremely revolutionary to say things like there is no slave or free in the Roman Empire to people who had been former slaves of the empire, male nor female in a time with, the height of patriarchy, Jew and Greek at a time when those distinctions really mattered politically, economically, in so many ways. So there's a revolutionary, he's trying to get there, but in the midst of that, he's also got these binaries that he's inherited from Greco-Roman culture that he's working through, or that he's making a new binary to try to break down the old. And it gets a little confusing for us as we're looking at it because we think they're all the same binaries. Bridget Call, who I referenced here, who has a great book on Galatians, she's the one who first kind of taught me about the connection between the Gaul people, the barbarians, the Gauls, and Galatia itself. She would say that by flesh, works of the flesh, that Paul's really making a reference to Rome, and that that the dichotomy that's being set up is life in the spirit versus the way of life as a Roman person. And that is the duality that has to exist at this particular moment in time for the people to figure out what it means to live in the spirit and in that countercultural presence. So again, back to those works, it's really about community, and Paul's contrasting the church with just Rome in general. And he's saying in this community, the way you live, the way people typically live as Romans is not going to work if we're going to build a community of equality and love. But yeah, the binaries make it confusing. They really make almost all of Paul's letters very challenging. Because when I heard this preached as a child, it was like works of the flesh were like passions and desires and basically anything bodily. But Paul doesn't mean body by flesh in this text. He's not using that as similes here. Because Paul also believed that we should present our bodies as a living sacrifice and that we should live out our love in radically political ways and all sorts of other things as well. So he wasn't just saying no to the body, yes to the spirit, which is the way, since Descartes, most people of faith have tried to divide up their lives. Is like, I've got church over here and politics over here, spiritual stuff over here, and justice stuff over here. And that's a Cartesian fallacy that we've inherited from Descartes and brought into Christianity. Body and spirit are one. There is no spirit without body, and there's no body without spirit. It's always one. And that duality is what we need to overcome. It's unfortunate that Paul has that. It looks like it's a body-spirit duality in Galatians when it's really not supposed to be.
Yeah, as hearing you explain that, thinking that one of the I won't say it's entirely a burden, but sort of the mixed blessing / burden of evangelicalism is kind of translating so much of what the biblical context is very geopolitical.
Yes.
So translating that into kind of a personal, individual experience. And so, so certainly so much of what gets written, particularly in the New Testament, is about kind of our community and the way that Rome is treating us, or the way that even in the First Testament, that sort of our Jewish identity contrasts with the identities around us, and then sort of evangelicalism makes it kind of all be about what's happening inside of me, and important. He walks with me and talks with me.
Yes, yes. Kind of thing. You're getting back right into what I spent so much time on Luther in this sermon.
Yes. Yeah.
So Krister Stendahl, who is a New Testament scholar, has a great book called Paul Among Jews and Gentiles, and in that book he has a famous essay called Paul and the Introspective Conscience of the West, where he traces Luther's interpretation of Paul all the way back to Augustine and says, this idea that Paul was sitting around concerned about his own sinfulness and thinking all the time about his own eternal destiny and his own sinfulness comes to us from Augustine and his Confessions, where Augustine is very concerned about his sinfulness and his eternal destiny. And then we know that Luther also was racked by guilt and very concerned about his eternal destiny as well. Probably so, because he lived a pretty ridiculous life out there. Sin boldly, right? So he's always racking himself in guilt about this. What comes out of both of that strain? By the way, those who don't know, Luther was an Augustinian monk before he started the Protestant Reformation. So he's read Augustine more times than most anybody in history. He loves Augustine. He's very individualistic, which is becoming a bigger thing in the Protestant time period, post-Renaissance, and he takes this book and he takes Romans 2, and he makes it all about individual salvation. Justification by faith becomes this doctrine that makes him feel good, literally makes him feel good that he's saved. And then he feels like that's his gift to the world. And we're going to have an entire reformation around it. Well, what we're left with now is this idea that, you'll hear this in almost every evangelical church in this city today. Somebody said, get right with Jesus. And you do that by praying a prayer and repenting. And that is what determines your eternal destiny, right? Giving your soul, take Jesus into your heart. I could give you many different other versions of this language. And it's all about your individual salvific identity and future. And that's what the whole faith is about. The whole thing, every book in the Bible, every teaching is all about trying to figure out how to get you to live right so you go to the right place, right? But Luther's genius was, even if you don't live right, as long as you believe the right things, you get to go. Right? And so you're justified only by your faith, not by anything you do, not by the works. Right? It's grace. It's all grace. You can be a horrible person. Luther said you could be a hangman. You could be an executioner who does not repent for your executions. And you're going, because as long as you believe the right things. And that's the gift, a nasty gift that we have inherited from him that really misinterprets Paul, which was writing about community and what it means to be justified by faith over and against all laws, not just Jewish law, but Roman law, Greek law, all law, and giving the community the freedom to live out its identity in Christ, regardless of what the Romans were trying to tell them to do. This antinomian kind of attitude that he had. And we've totally missed the boat on it. And now it's like we've made it into this individualistic thing. And it's because the people that wrote about it were very racked with their own guilt. It's amazing how much of human history has been determined by Luther's guilty conscience. I mean, that's a horrible thing. I mean, and that's, it can show you how a singular human being in a particular time in history who interprets the Bible can lead to tragic consequences, right?
Yeah, as a therapist, I've often wondered how different the church would be if, like, Luther had a therapist. Or just some antidepressants, honestly.
Right.
Yeah.
Or Augustine.
Augustine or Thomas Aquinas or lots of these people. Like, let's get some therapy.
Like, why are you so guilty? Like, what? Is there something about your mother that you need to share?
Well, that was true for Augustine, for sure.
That's for sure about Augustine.
And also, I mean, I think, too, just the way that kind of, the Wesleyan movement was shaped by kind of just the American thing, and how, I mean, in many ways, sort of evangelicalism as it spread across the globe has become a very peculiarly American endeavor. But the way that it's carried the tradition of these folks like Augustine and Luther.
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense why it worked here. I mean, if you think about it, it wasn't just appealing to folks on the frontier, as we often hear. It was a theology that divided body from spirit, which makes it very nice for America, which always had slavery when these religious traditions started to heat up. So if you can justify that the body of a person can be enslaved, but the soul can be Christian, and therefore they can stay in slavery and you don't have to lead toward emancipation, that's a very neat theology to have as an American, because it justifies for you the thing that is at the foundation of your economy and your society, especially in the South, where the evangelical revival movements really got rolling, you know. And of course, it's interesting that through history that has been one of the major breaking points for denominations. Can ministers hold slaves is why the Southern Baptist Convention was formed. Their answer was yes, of course. And that's why we have American Baptists and then all these other Baptist groups, because they said yes. And the same thing happened to Methodists at about the same time. Can pastors have slaves, be slave holders? And the answer was yes. And so it's really, to me, it's not surprising that that's the theology everybody in this country loves. It also leads to lots of violence, because we can justify people's oppression because we think they're going, as long as they're going somewhere when they die, everything that happens to them here is okay.
We've got about 10 till the hour.
Yeah,
How much more time?
Okay. Yeah.
You got one more question? Okay. So this question might be referring to passage that I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay.
So I'm not entirely sure exactly how it connects. Maybe you'll know. It says, doesn't Paul explain the Gospels in the letter to the Philippians? If one lives like a Philippians chapter 4 Christian, aren't we close to the life Christ intended for us?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in Philippians 4, I think we also get a vision of the fruits of the Spirit there that we also get here, and a way of living in joy and in peace and in gentleness. And I think that's probably right. And I think we should remember that that's what Paul meant by freedom in Christ. It was not freedom from all laws only, but freedom for a new way of living that centered around love and joy and peace and patience. You know, it would be really interesting, I think, wouldn't it be great if the rest of the world said, you know, I don't know about this Jesus, but Christians are just so joyful. They're just so joy-filled. It's like, you know, they're just always they just have so much joy, you know? That's really not how the world thinks about Christians, is it, you know? I think the fruits of the Spirit are absent in a lot of the Christianity that we see. Certainly not patient, certainly not kind. You know, we've tried, a lot of us who are here in this church have tried to run away from that kind of Christianity that is unkind, that bears no fruits of the Spirit. Paul would say the key marker to determine whether somebody is living life in the Spirit is to see the fruit. That's what he means by this. What fruit are they bearing in the world? Are they bearing more hatred, more violence, more oppression, more slavery? Or are they bearing love and peace and gentleness? What's coming? What is the fruit that they bear? That we can use that as a test to determine if somebody's really truly living in the Spirit. Not as like we kick you out if you don't if you're not, but really just to say, okay, this doesn't feel like this thing we're doing together is bearing the fruit that we've been called to bear in the world of more love, more generosity, right? More kindness. It's actually bearing the opposite of that. So maybe we need to check ourselves and look at this and see, is this really what we should be doing? And I think you can do that both individually, but I think more also corporately, like for a church. We need to look at ourselves and see, is this thing that we're holding on to, that we really care about, is it bearing fruit, the right fruit in the world? Is it bearing more love in the world, more generosity, more inclusivity, more kindness, more peace, joy? Or is it bearing more pain and confusion? You know, and I think that's one of the ways we can test ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's probably all of us can think about people in our lives that we just love being around.
Yeah.
You know, people who, I think about one of my earliest Sunday school teachers who's just such a sweet, kind woman. And I would have been in maybe kindergarten, maybe before that. And I just loved being around her. Like I can think of these people in the church I grew up in that I knew that they cared about me and that they loved me. And in some ways, I think this is maybe one of the gifts of evangelicalism is like, that it starts with me.
Yeah.
And that, you know, and I know for me particularly, it's helpful because I can so easily get overwhelmed with just how much awful things are going on in the world that I feel powerless to do anything about. And that's one of the gifts that sort of like, but I can do what I can do to be a person that folks want to be around.
Yes.
And I mean, and I'm kind of a grump, but to work on my grumpiness, but also work on what are the ways that people feel those things about here's somebody who cares about me, who listens to me, and that's the draw. And so it's not so much about the theology, it's about feeling that sense of love, and then how do we then as a community, and so that's the piece that evangelicalism sometimes misses. But how do we do that starting here and then moving on? So I don't know if there's anything, I'll sort of pitch that to you to close us out for our time.
Yeah, I love that, because I think one of the mysteries of life for all of us right now is that we're around people who, from time to time, I know I was, who may have the right political convictions but aren't bearing the fruits of the Spirit. Or may have the wrong political convictions, according to us, and be bearing the fruits of the Spirit. And that makes our lives very confusing, because we want to assume that if you're voting the right way and you've got the right politics, that you're going to live the right way too. And that, of course, is completely untrue. And so we have this world where I have friends and family who live the fruits of the Spirit in their life in ways that I'll never be able to do, and are Republican, conservative, right-wing. And they just disconnected, I think, in a lot of ways, some of their political views from their life in Christ, and but so have I from time to time. And I think I've also met a lot of people with liberal convictions who are horrible people, just horrible, mean, nasty. It's a mystery, right? It's a mystery. I've pastored 3 liberal churches. I've had people who are incredibly conscious social justice warriors that are just mean human beings to people. And it's really, that's where the mystery comes in. It's like, well, you and I, we can get on the same page politically, but God, could you show some more love or joy, peace in the world? So we got to have both. And I'm not even sure, in the end of the day, the political convictions would matter if we were all bearing the fruits of the Spirit. But so I think it's more than just the right. To me, the political stuff can be another form of right thinking. It can be another kind of Lutheran justification by faith. You're justified because you have the right beliefs. No, you got to live right too, right? And that's more important, really, than what you think.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for all the thought-provoking material, and I'm sure that all of us have got several things that we can take with us into the week, and I appreciate letting me kind of join you in this conversation.
Yeah.
I hope that everybody, I don't know how many of you have kids going back to school, or I hope that this week goes well for you, and it's been a pleasure to chat with you here this morning.
Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah,
thank you all.